Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. I'm excited to continue our conversation with Dr. Chris Talbot. She's the author of Sonia Johnson, a Mormon feminist. It's an award-winning book here on Gospel Tangents. We gave it an award as the best Mormon feminist book of 2024. In our next conversation, we're going to dive deep into the conflict between Sonia Johnson and the LDS Church. What made church leaders so angry with Sonia? What were some of the arguments that the LDS Church used against the Equal Rights Amendment to prevent its ratification by the states in the late 1970s? We'll talk more about this as well as the Phil Donahue Show. That was a big deal and made Sonia Johnson a national figure. So you won't want to miss this conversation. Check it out. And so then, is it more of a President Kimball or Barbara Smith thing that really pushes the church towards anti-ERA?
It's hard to know because I don't know the conversations that Smith and Kimball were had. I'd really like to know that. So it's hard to know, but it seemed the organizational framework really seems to come from the Special Affairs Committee. And what the Special Affairs Committee seems to have done in Virginia is Hinckley came to Virginia, told the regional representative, a guy named Julian Lowe, to get the women.
Gordon B. Hinckley was the head of special
was the head of special affairs. Yeah.
Yeah. Was he an apostle?
He was an apostle.
Okay.
Yeah. So he came, told this guy, Julian Lowe, who's the regional representative, to get the women organized. Julian Lowe sort of fell down, and they asked a woman named Beverly Campbell and another woman who becomes less important to the story, but and to sort of organize this Virginia Citizens Council, and they do. And it's interesting because there's a lot of attention paid to sort of the language around this organization. I have the meeting notes of the first meeting of this organization. Now, it's important to recognize that the meeting notes were taken from a recording and from notes made by MERA members.
Recording, like an audio recording, is that what you're saying?
The notes say that they're from an audio recording, and then at some point the tape runs out, and then they're from notes after that, and so. But the document itself is produced by MERA members.
Okay.
But what it says is that the men come into the meeting and say, well, so the prophet has asked us to organize this organization of women to oppose the ERA. Essentially. And then Beverly Campbell takes over, and Campbell's going to become a pretty big deal as this moves forward. And then she takes over and gives out a packet of information. We don't know what is in the packet, but she gives out this information and says, this is the church's position and the position we would like you to take. And Sonia sees that as a kind of direct authority from Hinckley to Julian Lowe to Campbell to the women. No, let's have a conversation about what we think about the Equal Rights Amendment. Let's have a conversation about whether we think we should support it or not. She sees it as this very sort of dictatorial, here's what you should think. Now go out and think it. And go out and act as though you think it. And so I forgot what the question was, but that's sort of how the Virginia Citizens Council.
Barbara Smith and Kimball.
Oh, yeah. So it really, the organizational element really seems to come from the Special Affairs Committee. Okay. And some of the legal arguments come from a guy named Rex Lee.
Oh.
Who you might know of. And
I know who he is, but to let other people know.
He was an attorney and was the president of BYU. I can't remember the years. Do you remember the years?
I don't remember the years. It was the Florida Hoax, though. It was probably 60s, 70s.
60s, 70s, right around in there. But he wrote I don't know, sort of a pamphlet/book. It's about, I'd say, 80, 90 pages.
Well, he's also Mike Lee's father, right?
Yeah.
Senator Mike Lee.
Yeah, also Senator Mike Lee's father. But he wrote sort of the legal argument in opposition of to the ERA that the church uses pretty widely after 1980.
Okay. And he had a legal background as well.
Yeah.
Wasn't he going to be on the nominee for the Supreme Court or something?
I have no idea.
I think that's
true.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
Yeah, so
our listeners will look.
He wrote this. Yeah, please do. He wrote this 90 page document about a sort of legal argument against the ERA that rested really on two pillars. One was what we call congressional intent, which is what does Congress intend for this amendment to do after it's passed? And that's sort of one avenue that he argues. And the second avenue that he argues about is at the state level, some states have equal rights amendments for the state that have very similar language. So let's look at how those state level amendments have been interpreted by state Supreme Courts.
Okay.
And Campbell becomes a pretty public notable after, in the 1980s, we can talk about that. But she very much uses that set of logic and a couple of other documents. A guy named Irwin and what is his first name? Can't remember his first name. It'll come to me in a minute. A guy named Irwin who makes a sort of similar argument in the congressional debates. Sam Irwin, there we go. And a couple of other things. A guy named Freund, teaches the law school somewhere. And sort of really builds those arguments, those kind of legal arguments for why people should oppose the Equal Rights Amendment. In the 1980s, as she comes to national attention, really in the wake of Sonia Johnson.
Okay. Well, I'm curious about this. I know I've spoken with another scholar, and one of the things that he said was one of the big arguments against the ERA amendment was, well, if the ERA amendment gets passed, all the women will become lesbians and all the men will become gay, and it'll be the downfall of society. Can you talk more about that argument?
Yes, I can. So the church tends to use a kind of slippery slope argument.
Okay.
And I can talk about this for hours, so I'll try to give you a brief version. Essentially most of this comes from the local, the state level Supreme Court rulings about state level ERAs. And those rulings are fairly significantly misrepresented in most of these legal reasonings. I've read it, all but one of them that I can't find. So if anybody knows about the case about athletics in Colorado, anyway, and I've read all these cases, so they're fairly significantly misrepresented. And what Lee and mostly Campbell in this case say about these cases is things like women and men will be playing athletics together, and they'll be changing their clothes to prepare for their co-ed football game in the same locker room.
Sounds like the bathroom.
It's just not true. It's simply just not an accurate representation of what these cases actually say. So the Athletic Ones, for example, says that if there is no women's athletic team for something like, let's say, football, for this example, if there's no women's football team and a high school girl really wants to play football and there's no women's football team and she qualifies to play football, you are legally required to allow her to play on the boys' team. It doesn't say women and men playing, boys and girls playing football together and changing in the same locker room. And
well, there have been, I know that there, it usually makes the news. Hey, there's a woman on usually the kicker on the boys' football team, and usually they're pretty good. And so, but we've never forced the woman to change her clothes in front of the men.
No, we have not.
In any situation,
some of these arguments were just absurd interpretations of these state Supreme Court cases. Just absurd. But the slippery slope argument goes, well, if they're playing football together, then they'll be changing together, and then gender as a category will completely disappear, and social chaos will ensue. And if gender as a category completely disappears, then there's nothing to make marriage particularly heterosexual. There's nothing to prohibit all various forms of sexuality among people. There's no way to sort of regulate that. And the fear really was a completely genderless society.
I don't think much has changed.
Well, to be fair, the ERA has not been passed. There is some anxiety about that, particularly right now around that sort of trans issues and that sort of gender queer issues.
Right.
But as it turns out, most people still identify as men and women, and we don't yet have a genderless society.
But
that was sort of the slippery slope to how we get to everyone's going to be gay.
We have gotten rid of the stigma of being gay.
For the most part, some.
Compared to the 70s,
sure,
especially.
Compared to the 70s, absolutely. Yeah.
And so, because being gay has been destigmatized, could it be argued that the slippery slope happened? Would you agree with that?
It depends on how one thinks of the slippery slope. I mean, if the fear was everyone's going to become gay, that doesn't seem to be terribly accurate.
No.
The other thing that's difficult about that is there were, in fact, gay people in the 1970s.
What?
As it turns out, there in fact have been people engaged in queer sex, probably from the beginning of time, but certainly from the beginning when we have records. So it's really a question of, is it about the gay people, or is it about how the gay people are received and how the gay people are understood by a culture? So it's hard to make an argument that that slippery slope makes people gay.
Okay.
It might make gay people more public and more out and more
Shouldn't we just go back in the closet?
I'm not taking that beat. Right. But so it's, it sort of depends on how you conceive of what the slippery slope is.
Okay. But the downfall of society has not happened, or
Not yet.
I guess it depends on who you talk to, though.
Sure. Of course. Yeah.
All right. So I know another big issue with church leaders, and Sonia Johnson especially, was when she said that you shouldn't invite Mormon missionaries in anymore.
Okay. So she didn't actually say that.
Okay.
I knew this was going to come up. And it's important to understand there.
Isn't that how the church interpreted it, though?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And I'm happy to talk about that. So it's important to understand the context in which she made the remark that that is under discussion.
Okay.
And the context was she had been called to Kalispell, Montana, to talk to a chapter of the National Organization for Women, which at this point was basically a pro-ERA lobbying group. It did other things, but that was sort of its kind of central lane. And so she'd been asked to talk, and they had told her before the meeting, we're not letting Mormon missionaries into our houses anymore because of the church's activism against the ERA.
Okay.
And she said, oh, well, that's interesting. And so during the meeting, she says, let's see, I've got the exact quote marked in here. So during the meeting, now keep in mind, she thinks she's talking to a crowd that already is not allowing missionaries into their house because of the Equal Rights Amendment.
Okay.
So here's what she said. She says that because Mormons were very proselyting people, she says, quote, and we've got a good thing going and we'd like you to hear about it. And then she talks about the church's concern with its public image because of its missionary efforts. And she says then that those who are directing this ERA activity need a taste of the consequences of their behavior. And one of the things everybody can do is write them and call them the very headquarters of the church and say you are outraged that the Mormons are working against equal civil rights for women, that if their missionaries ever come to your doors, you wouldn't consider letting them in. So that's the exact quote. And the context is, if you're not letting them in, but nobody knows you're not letting them in, then you're not going to have the kind of power that you want to. What she's saying is you got to tell the church that you're not letting them in.
Okay.
You're already not letting them in. But if nobody knows,
what's the point?
What's the point? So you've got to call the church and say, here's what we're doing. So that's one context. And then another context that didn't make the book, but that I'm publishing an article about in Mormon Studies Review soon, is that people had also not allowed missionaries in about the priesthood ban.
Right.
And the priesthood and temple bans had just been lifted in June, I think.
1978.
Of 1978. And this is October of 1978.
Okay.
And so she sort of felt like one of the things that had lifted the ban was people not letting missionaries into their home because of the priesthood ban. So she had a sense that this was a tactic that might matter.
It might work.
That might have some influence on church leaders. So there's a couple of contexts that make that quote make more sense. So she did sort of say something that can be interpreted in that way.
Okay.
But if you have these contexts, what she's saying is to a crowd that's already not letting missionaries in, you've got to tell people that this is why you're not letting missionaries in, or it's not going to have the effect that you want.
Okay. So basically she was saying, don't just not let missionaries in. really just call Salt Lake and say, I'm opposed to letting missionaries in because you oppose the ERA.
Correct.
And so really she was lobbying. And
Yeah.
if there's anything the church hates, it's lobbying.
Yeah, and she talks about it that way later. She says, this is a quid pro quo. I'll listen to your missionaries if you'll listen to me about the ERA. And you're not listening to me, so I'm not listening to you. Okay. Was sort of the message she intended to convey.
All right.
And it was also misquoted in the press.
Okay.
It was quoted, I don't know if I have that one. Let's see. I probably do. Misquoted as having said, if a missionary comes to your door, tell him you're not interested in a church that is fighting equal rights.
But she never said that.
She didn't say exactly that. She said what I read. I've listened to this thing 100 times, probably at least 50 times. But she said what I read. And so somebody, they didn't have as fancy recording devices as we have now. And so this woman just sort of taking notes, the reporter's taking notes as fast as she can. And that's sort of how that got reported to the press, is don't let the missionaries in. And one of the things that comes up in the trial actually is Sonia says, in the church trial, I have this recording. You can listen to what I actually said. What you have there highlighted in the newspaper is not what I actually said. And basically, again, all we have not really again, but all we have about the trial is from Sonia. So we don't really have anything from church. We have a little bit from Beverly Campbell. What Sonia reports is that they basically refused to listen to the recording and was like, look here in the paper. It says you said this. It says you said don't let missionaries in. So it's a complicated, convoluted, messy piece of what she actually said in the context in which she said it.
Okay. So she gets excommunicated and then she starts going on all the TV shows. Is that what pretty much happened?
She goes on a couple before she actually gets excommunicated. Okay. Because there are sort of threats and the excommunication is a 2-day process. So the first one takes place, I think, on November 17th and the second one on December 1st. And so, reporters are at the November 17th trial because they think she's getting excommunicated and then doesn't get excommunicated for reasons we could talk about if you'd like.
Yeah, let's do it.
Yeah, well, so I don't really know, but what she says happened is she went into the excommunication and they had no charges. And they have these piles and piles of notes. And so she said, all right, if I'm going to defend myself, I'd like to have some charges against which I'm defending myself. Because that's sort of what a trial is. As you have some idea of what people think you've done wrong so that you can defend yourself. And she says they spent about 5 hours sort of organizing what the charges were. And about 5 hours later, it's like 11:30 at night by the time we've agreed on some charges. And so they agreed to sort of put the trial off for 2 weeks.
So that she can prepare.
So that she can prepare a defense, because she's kind of made this argument that I can't prepare a successful defense unless I know what I'm defending myself against. Okay. And you don't have anything to say about what I'm defending myself against. I'm just sort of showing up.
And this is just a bishop's court, essentially. So she's just talking to her bishop and a couple of counselors, maybe? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. And so then
this ends up being called a pre-trial meeting.
Okay.
And then they have the official trial on December 1st.
Okay. Yeah. And same sort of thing. And are reporters outside for both?
Reporters are outside for both. Yeah. Okay. Reporters are outside for the first one. And so because of this sort of lengthy process, she's in the news for a while. Right? I mean, she gets the summons early November, and there's one of her students is at his house, is at their house when she gets the summons, and he makes a couple of phone calls and it gets leaked to the press. And so that's, so the phone starts ringing the next morning and that sort of begins the process of her most public notoriety. She'd been in some local rags about the citizens' councils and stuff like that. But her kind of national notoriety really begins at that summons and really lasts through February, March, April.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, and wasn't she on the Phil Donahue Show, which was a big deal back in the day? Show,
which is a big deal back in the day. We don't really even have shows like that anymore. But yeah, he was sort of the Oprah of the 1980s. Yeah. Oprah doesn't even do Oprah anymore. So Donahue was a daytime talk show that was syndicated for just years and years and years. Mm-hmm. And she appeared by herself. And that was a fiasco. I could write a whole article about the Donahue Show alone. So I don't know how much information you want about that. But yeah, she appeared by herself in a full hour on a Donahue.
Well, no, let's do that because I know there was supposed to be a church spokesman.
Yeah.
But it wasn't a man, and so
so this is messy.
Story.
This is very messy. So I have 4 records of the story. I have one for Sonia. I have one on a somewhat obscure and hard to find recording from the Donahue producer, whose name is Darlene Hayes.
Oh.
I have one from Beverly Campbell, and I have one from Barbara Smith, and none of them agree with each other.
Oh, wow. So how do you do that? How do you deal with that when you're a historian?
Well, in this book, I didn't have several pages to write about the Donahue story.
Can tell us all about it.
So I dealt with it by saying, this is the best I can do from these 4 sources of what I think is most likely to have happened.
Okay.
So what is most likely to have happened is that, so they put this show together in like 5 days. Donahue put this show together in 5 days. So that's some important context.
So is this after November 17th or December 1st?
So this is after Sonia's been excommunicated on December 6th.
Okay.
When the producer first calls her and says, hey, do you want to be on our show? So the producer first calls her something like a Tuesday. I can't remember exactly how it falls. Somewhere in there's a weekend. And they're filming it on the Wednesday after the weekend. They call her, I don't know, Tuesday or Wednesday before the weekend. They say, will you be on our show? And she takes a day or to sort of think, like, to panic. And then say, yes, of course, I'll be on your show. And will you come on our show and debate a church representative?
Well, it had to be pretty shocking.
Sure.
Phil Donahue.
I mean, she's just like some woman.
Yeah.
She's a housewife in Virginia. They wanted to come be on a nationally syndicated television talk show. So she said yes. And then they called the church PR office, and the church PR office says, yes, we'll figure out someone to send. And here's where it gets murky.
Okay.
It seems as the best I can piece out, it seems as though the church's PR office asked Barbara Smith, and it's not clear whether Barbara Smith said, no, I would not like to go, or if someone else in the church said, no, we can't have Barbara Smith. Smith says, I would not, that she says no. Darlene Hayes and Sonia Johnson, Smith and Campbell says that Smith said no. Hayes and Sonia say that the brethren kept Barbara Smith from going. So it's not clear.
But somehow Barbara didn't show up.
And Barbara throws out this name of Beverly Campbell because Beverly Campbell had been chair of the Citizens Council in Virginia. It also probably didn't hurt that she was the head of a public relations firm. So they had some level of confidence in her ability to represent the position fairly well on something like a talk show. So they asked Beverly Campbell, someone asks Beverly Campbell, and Campbell's getting her hair done on the way to the show when she gets word that Sonia won't appear with Beverly Campbell. And so Sonia tells the producer, Darlene Hayes, just let Campbell go on by herself. And Darlene says, no, we want you. And at that moment, Sonia sort of realizes, oh, I actually have a level of control here. I have a level of control. And so Sonia says, get me somebody who's in a position of power in the church, who's making decisions about the church's opposition to the ERA, and I would be happy to talk to them.
Which meant a man, right?
Which meant a man.
Or a priesthood leader, maybe.
Yeah, and at some point later, she says, I'll take any of them or all of them at once. And so and to Sonia's mind, Beverly Campbell's like just some woman. She has no official relationship to the church. She has no official capacity in the church. She's just some woman who organized in Virginia.
Just like her, basically. Yeah.
She's just some woman who has no real decision-making authority. And so she sort of begins a kind of policy that she will not debate Mormon women because she sees them as being manipulated, dictated to by the men. and the men again. And so she basically says, I'm not talking to Mormon women because they are not the ones creating the policy. They are not the ones creating the church's position. And they are not really even in charge of their own activism. They're being active. They're being, these citizens' councils are being created at the direction of the Special Affairs Committee and coming down through these priesthood lines of authority. The women are not actually doing this of their own free will. They're doing it because the men are asking them to. So I will debate the men.
So not even somebody like a Barbara Smith would be acceptable to her? I mean, I find that interesting because Barbara's kind of a big deal.
Yeah. At this point, no, because her sense is that Barbara Smith is probably also being dictated. That seems not to be particularly accurate. In fact, it seems to be more accurate that Barbara Smith is sort of telling Kimball why we should oppose this amendment. But that's sort of her sense is that even if Barbara Smith was not being told that, Barbara Smith is nonetheless not the person making church policy.
Okay.
Right. So
because everything goes through the priesthood.
Church policy because everything goes through the priesthood.
All right. And then, so how does it go?
It goes fairly interestingly. She goes on the Donahue Show and she's on for the full hour by herself. A couple of weeks later, it's worth noting that Barbara Smith and Beverly Campbell appear together for the full hour as well. So they sort of get their time. And she doesn't really prepare anything or plan anything. I mean, one of the things that continually astounds me about Sonia is her fairly natural ability to talk to reporters. And she's fairly fearless about it. She is happy to go on Donahue and be on a nationally syndicated talk show as like just some woman from Virginia. A well-educated woman for sure, but nonetheless, just some woman. I think that might terrify me a little bit. To go on Donahue as just some woman. But she just has this kind of natural fearlessness and natural ability around it, which is fairly astounding. So she goes on, and she gets some audience questions, and it is interesting because a good number of the audience, so the Donahue Show used to take questions from the audience and then also on the telephone.
Right.
And it's clear sort of from some kind of linguistic giveaways that many of the people asking questions are members of the church. There's just a kind of
have our own lingo
that you can sort of recognize and a kind of so it's just interesting and kind of noteworthy. That
like in the audience or on the phone?
Some in the audience and some on the phone.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And one of the most interesting ones is conversation. And this happens on, things like this also happen on many of the radio shows that she's on where people take caller questions. And it's interesting because her whole argument is that women oppose the ERA, Mormon women oppose the ERA because the prophet says so. And one of the things that she does is when women call her and sort of that have these linguistic giveaways, she'll push them. Why are you opposing the ERA? 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 And most of the time it gets to, well, because the prophet says so.
Which is what she expected.
Yeah. And so in many ways, many of these conversations sort of confirm this sense that women oppose the ERA because the prophet says so, not because they've thought through their own political positions.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's pretty interesting. One of the other topics of conversation on the Donahue Show is whether Sonia is a one-off excommunication or whether other women who support the ERA are likely to be excommunicated. And her sense is, and I have other evidence to suggest this as well, her sense is that in fact supporting the ERA can be reason for excommunication. As the Sonia Johnson situation heats up in the press, the church comes out as saying that's not true. You can absolutely support the Equal Rights Amendment. You just can't do it in the ways that are mean to the brethren that Sonia's doing it. And you can't do it in ways that say don't let missionaries in your house, things like that. But you're free to support the ERA and not be excommunicated. But there seems to be some evidence that there had been some excommunications in other places. In newspaper articles and things like that for supporting the Equal Rights Amendment. I'm not super clear about that because all I have is most of these are anonymous reports. And of course, the church doesn't have a list of excommunications.
There's no
as it should not. As it should not. And none of those records are public as they should not be. So I can't really confirm that there are these other excommunications.
Well, it's just interesting because there's a lot of parallels with like the ordained women movement and, even the gay marriage movement. I mean, Sonia is different in the fact that she was so public, a lot like Kate Kelly in that respect. But it's interesting. Are there any other TV shows that she was on besides Donahue that were important?
Yeah, she was on a couple of like kind of local network television shows across the country, mostly on things like PBS stations. She was on Tom Snyder programs. She was on, one of the reasons Donahue is most important is because it's the only one I can find a recording of.
Oh, okay.
Some of these others I have transcripts of, and some of these others I just have sort of, I was on the show. But she was on like the Today Show. She interviewed with Diane Sawyer. She interviewed with Tom Snyder, who was a big kind of news guy at the time. She was on most of the morning shows. So she was on a lot of news broadcasts.
Does it make a big difference when you compare a transcript to, say, a video where you can hear the inflections of voice?
Yes, and particularly with Sonia, actually. I have a quotation in here from Linda
And maybe even the body language?
Linda Silito talks about the difference between Sonia's written word and spoken word. She's incredibly clever and has a little bit of a dark wit. And so the vocal intonation of the dark wit makes it clear that it's supposed to be funny.
Okay.
But written, it's just dark. So she says things like, I'll put my patriarchs against your patriarchs any day. And written, that sort of looks a little bit like a little mean. But the way she says it, it's sort of meant to be a joke and sort of funny. And so she has a sort of acerbic, dark wit about her that is very different in the public word than when it's written. Yeah. So generally, yes, but in her case, especially, I think, because of that kind of ironic, sardonic, kind of dark wittiness. She's incredibly funny, actually. But, when it's written out, the tone doesn't come with it. And so it's hard to piece out that was actually said ironically or sardonically or...
Yeah. Well, interesting. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Chris Talbot. She's the author of Sonia Johnson, a Mormon Feminist, award-winning book here on Gospel Tangents. So in our next conversation, we're going to dive into Sonia Johnson's presidential campaign and her attempt to run the National Organization of Women.
So then she ran for president, which is incredibly ironic because there's hardly a more patriarchal, hierarchical thing that one could do than run for U.S. president. But she sort of runs reluctantly.
If you like what we're doing here on Gospel Tangents, please sign up for our Patreon. And for as little as $5 a month, you can access the entire interviews. We can also show full videos and give access to collections. So sign up at patreon.com/gospeltangents. Help support me to keep this podcast running.